a different approach, the approach of cities, the lens of cities, but we will see some very interesting connections. I was thinking that some numbers are that cities consume almost 80% of the world's energy. They contribute about 60% of greenhouse gas emissions. When it comes to surface, they only represent or account for about 2% of the Earth's surface. But as you said in the presentation, 50% of the world population live in urban areas, and this is expected to grow by to be about 68% by 2050. So cities have a huge impact on climate change, and of course they are impacted by climate change. We are in a world of cities, and we can look at the world through the lens of cities, and cities are becoming even more important than ever. It's very interesting that during the pandemic there was a lot of talk about the question, is the end of cities in the United States? For example, with New York, people were saying, is this the end of New York? Many people were moving to other parts of the country, going to less populated areas, and of course there were massive areas of the city that were empty. Today, New York is booming, more people than ever. Real estate prices are through the roof. Rentals are incredibly expensive. Many of those people who moved to other parts of the country are back. Cities clearly are back. And climate change is a global story, and cities are a global story as well, and they are related. So I'm going to talk about my most recent co-author book, which is Emerging Global Cities, published by Columbia University Press just about a month ago. And this is a book that its origin is in a previous book that I published that I wrote with Professor Portes that focused on one city, on the city of Miami. And the title is The Global Age, Miami in the 21st Century. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But what happened was that after we published that book, we happened to travel to the United Arab Emirates. My colleague went to teach to New York University in Abu Dhabi, visited frequently Dubai, and we started to talk how similar Dubai was to Miami. Further conversations with urban scholars made clear that the resemblance was more than superficial, that there were many characteristics there that connected these cities. And so as we look at the similarities between Miami and Dubai, we started to pay attention to a third city, Singapore. And we had both visited the city and also were impacted by extraordinary economic achievements, educational achievements, its incredible growth. So the similarities between these three cities became apparent, and we started looking at something in particular, their distinct role in the global economy. And this is going to be very important in the analysis. So we concluded that these cities were really a particular type of city, that we could not easily identify other metropolitan areas with similar profiles. So we decided to look at these three cities in detail. So what is the general context? Competition for recognition and capital influence in the world economy is fierce. Many cities aspire to be the next Dubai, the next Singapore, or to displace Miami as the capital of the Americas. An essential element of this race is the branding of cities as desirable places for investment and consumption. So just as cars and airlines seek to gain favorable attention, cities brand themselves as well, inventing catchy labels to advertise their most appealing features and attempting to conceal less charming aspects, such as deep socioeconomic inequalities. These efforts include deliberate attempts to attract investments in capital, in intangible and tangible infrastructure, and also to attract members of what has been called the creative class. This is a group of global talent, highly trained people in tech, banking and finance, law, healthcare, arts, etc. So, what we see is that these cities are trying to do everything possible, including high-tech expositions at art fairs, congress, sports events, to attract global attention. For several reasons, these branding efforts, no matter how motivated or expensive, tend to fail, at least in terms of projecting a city into a permanent position of prominence. Multinational corporations and wealthy investors are skittish, and don't they really position their regional headquarters or trust their money to just any one place? Similarly, members of the creative class are highly selective about where they want to live, work, and invest. For that reason, history records numerous examples from the last century into the present of cities that at one point or another were poised to attain positions of global or regional importance, but eventually failed to do so. So I will talk a little bit more about that later. So, our book tells three stories. The first of these stories focuses on the emergence and transformation of Miami, Dubai, and Singapore as what we call emerging global cities. Cities that, despite following different historical paths, have achieved newfound prominence individually and collectively. Second is the story of cities that have or had the resources to become thriving, prominent cities, but have not yet been able to achieve a globalized position. Their position instead situated within their national and regional areas. They are what we call global hopefuls, and in the book we look at three of these global hopefuls: Sao Paulo, Lagos, Sao Paulo in Brazil, Lagos in Nigeria, and a past case of New Orleans in the United States. And lastly, the third story is the story around the future of these cities, both emerging globals and global hopefuls, and how climate change, but also inequality and politics, threaten the pillars on which the aspirations for global status of these cities stand. So, like other urban scholars, we were impressed by the work of Saskia Sassen, which has been very influential. Her work on New York, London, and Tokyo, cities that she identified as being global cities. She did this not based on their size or national significance, but because of their function in the world economy. They are urban entities suspended, as it were, above their respective national spaces and playing a command and control role for financial and economic activities extended worldwide. So the prime insight of this work was something very interesting, that while communications and transportation innovations made possible the decentralization of industrial production and commercial distribution on a global basis, as we know, the coordination of their multiple functions could not be decentralized. On the contrary, the more than that productive and commercial activities spread in space, the more they require a tightly controlled central presence among key decision makers and interaction in close physical contact with one another. So these functions are located in the nerve centers of the global economy, of the world economy, and these are the global cities. So the other element that Sassen identified was that there was a central social fact in these cities, that it is the bifurcation of the urban population between a minority working and profiting from international trade, finance, and other globalized activities, and a majority whose occupations were purely local in scope, modestly or very poorly remunerated, and commonly insecure. And this is a very important element. So, what we see is that for some time there was the assumption that, okay, the evolution of global capitalism led to the emergence of these three global cities and some other cities that are important, for example, in Europe, etc. But what we argue is that some cities that were not producing anything, Miami, for example, never went through industrialization, is not a center of technology. Dubai, another example. These cities, and I'll explain how they did it, took advantage of opportunities that emerge in the world economy, where still there is room for occupying that space of coordinating trade, financial, and banking banking relations, and to serve as important global centers for real estate commercialization and as centers for art and culture. That is all that is connected. This is a phenomenon that if we go back 50 years ago, probably no one would have predicted. And this is what we study in this city. So, reflecting on the trio of emerging global cities, Miami, Singapore, and Dubai, several things became obvious. First, each of them played a similar role in their respective region of the world to those previously described by Sassen on a global scale. Second, the rise of these cities to position of economic, financial, and cultural prominence did not happen by chance, but was the consequence of decisive and sustained efforts by key actors located in each of them, which took advantage of favorable geopolitical conditions. Only in this manner they were able to surpass their regional rivals, striving for the same position of prominence. And third, well, these were the only cities that we could identify with a comparable profile worldwide. Many others were attempting to surpass them or achieve the same level of prominence, but without success. So, despite their very different origins and history, these three cities are remarkably similar in their present economic profile and social structure. All three boast enormous ports and airports, serving as centers for international trade and points for the transshipment of commodities to other nations and cities in their respective regions. All three feature major banking and financial centers operating as coordinating centers for multiple forms of investment, mergers, and acquisitions on an international scale. And all three have developed a vast real estate sector in their respective regions, but with much broader appeal. And finally, all three have become important tourist destinations and regional centers for commercial art and culture. So, the series of events that led to the consolidation of these three cities as these emerging globals are different, indicating that there is not a set recipe for urban places aspiring to the same position. But all three managed to take advantage of their unique geographic locations and to couple them with a series of institutional innovations that gained the confidence of capital, both corporate and private. And this is the story that we develop in the book. Let me summarize it very briefly. So despite their difference in historical origins, these cities possess three common characteristics. First, a reliable legal system capable of inducing confidence among both corporate and individual investors. Second, an efficient pro-business government bureaucracy generally immune to corruption. And third, an iron will on the part of leaders determined to make their city succeed against global competition. In the cases of Dubai and Singapore, that role was assumed by motivated political leaders. In Miami, it fell to a class of single-minded exiled bankers and financiers coming from Cuba. So, there are four main implications for urban theory and policy that we can derive from these experiences. The first, the most obvious, that these cities have done away with what was a past conception that it was a division, a divide between those global cities in the what was called the first world and those cities in the periphery or in the old conception of the world of the third world, the developing world. This divide is now qualified by the experience of cities that were once peripheral in the global economy and now have managed to ascend to strategic positions. This talks about something very interesting, which is that there is a measure of flexibility within the global economic system. The second implication is that industrialism and development are no longer synonymous. Because, as I said, two of these cities, Miami, Dubai, never went through industrialization. Nothing. So this is challenging that assumption. The third implication is that cities no longer serve as passive marketplaces. The city itself has become an actor. Cities are now trying to, as I was saying earlier, create a brand. And a brand is extremely important for all these reasons. And then, finally, the fourth implication is that these cities show the novel ways in which migration and the city have become intertwined. Because these three cities are cases where what was accomplished would have never been possible without the massive inflow of migrant workers, different kinds of workers and coming from different places that made possible the growth in these cities, from banking to construction. So, one can say this is a wonderful story, this is extraordinary, this is, fantastic. But remember what I mentioned about bifurcation, is that one characteristic of these cities that goes along what was found in the global cities is this profound divide within the population. And again, the structure is very similar. A minority of the population, the residents, that they work in the finance, banking, trade sector, and a majority that works in services, in support, in construction, in supporting consumption in all ways possible. And this sector of the population lives under great insecurity for different kinds of reasons, does not have the same access to rights as the rest of the population, live from paycheck to paycheck, and many times, like in Dubai, live in particular parts of the city, in separated, in conditions, housing conditions that are very, very troublesome. That is, there are important questions about rights and violations in many cases of human rights. Very briefly, there is another category, what we call, as I mentioned, global hopefuls. That is, this is still with this issue of inequality, still we live in a world where there is an aspirational story. My experience, at least, is that I talk about this around the world, and I talk to large groups of policymakers, local leaders, financiers, real estate owners, and everybody wants to be a globalizing city. Everybody. I haven't found a place where they say we don't want to globalize. It's an aspiring story, and many cities try to aspire to that. And in the book, we don't have time to get into that today, but we look at these three cases that I mentioned. A case like Sao Paulo, the most important city in Brazil, in this case a mega city, and why Sao Paulo has never been able to achieve this status. Finally, to conclude, the third story that this book talks about is that the future of these cities, and of course other cities as we've seen, is uncertain. And it is uncertain because of climate change, and I'm not going to get into that. We discussed that in the book, how climate change impacts the case of Miami is very, very interesting in that sense, how climate change could represent the end of Miami as we know it. The second element is inequalities that these cities need to address, major inequalities that only get deeper, and these could affect their future, their brand. And third, the issue of politics. And in that case, we look at yet another case of a city that, when I say the name of the city, you will clearly see this as a city that had achieved a globalizing status. Hong Kong. But Hong Kong is a potential case of a receding globalizing city because the presence of China, the restriction on civil rights, political rights, has created a very important new phenomenon that we yet have to see, which is an initial exodus of both companies that are moving to other parts of the world, to other cities, such as Singapore, for example, and talent, where that global talent that had been attracted by Hong Kong is leaving because of the restriction in terms of political and civil rights. So the future of cities is uncertain. Climate change, inequalities, political and geopolitical changes are going to continue affecting what we see in the world. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Armoni, for sharing what you have done in your research, a kind of presentation of your book, which is very, very interesting, in fact. And it's a kind of new topic for us also.
Yes.
Trying to understand about Miami, Singapore, Dubai, right? And it's kind of story of rise and fall of cities also. Some cities are emerging to become global cities, while Hong Kong is falling, collapsing. So those stories, it's very, very interesting. I think in your analysis, when we listen to your analysis, we can connect some of these things. Although I think I'm afraid to say that Kathmandu is really becoming a global city because there are lots of issues in Kathmandu city and other big cities of Nepal. But we can connect some of the things, for example, climate change issue and Kathmandu, right? At the same time, let's say urban politics, right? Urban politics and development. And then next is, let's say, inequality, like squatter settlement management here. It's a kind of everyday news of these days in Kathmandu city also. It's the news of Dharan, it's the news of elsewhere as well. So we can connect these kinds of issues with our, let's say, national scenario also. And I think the analysis you have presented is very much rich, and I'm enlightened actually, and I hope that the audience is also enlightened. I'll come up with my summary later. Now let me open the floor first. If you have any questions, now you're free to ask questions, and he is very willing to respond. Yes, please.
So you talk about climate change risk in Miami. If Miami actually succeeds in some of the new proposals to protect the city from sea level rise and storm surges, etc., perhaps that could be another positive example for Miami of addressing climate change to the world, which could be a benefit to Miami as an emerging city instead of a challenge.
Well, if really a core group of policymakers in Miami, of leaders, were to see this clearly, and these proposals were in fact implemented, absolutely, that could become a win-win of extraordinary proportions, because not only this is protecting and taking the city to a next level, but again, in terms of the prominence of the city, it could be extraordinary. I think that it's more difficult than that, because first, as we saw in the previous book on Miami, there is no clear consensus about how to go seriously with policies and programs to address the issue of particularly rising sea levels. That's one. Second is that, as you were explaining and the questions were addressing, inequality and climate change are profoundly intertwined. So one phenomenon that we see in Miami, I don't know, Daniel, if you mentioned the term climate gentrification. That is, what we are seeing in terms of rising sea levels is a very interesting change in terms of the value of land. Land that was for many decades occupied by the less affluent populations that was worth very little is now gaining in value because of climate change, and therefore is pushing out those populations into other areas, destroying community life, destroying, all that life that was created and that local economy, etc., so that the real estate development, what is called the growth machine, takes over. So it is a very interesting question, and it would be phenomenal, but it has many dimensions that are very complicated that we yet have to see how they evolve.
And that is the key, I think, though, for Miami. Have you, the climate change answer?
Absolutely. What's interesting in terms of that is that Miami in the recent years tried to position itself as the world capital of another very interesting, very different thing. Do you remember? Cryptocurrency. So cities are all the time looking for opportunities, and in this case it's very interesting because this is the intangible economy that is so important. But of course crypto also has an impact on climate change. All these things are fascinating. And Miami tried to position itself as the mayor said, the capital of crypto, and then we had all the backlash with cryptocurrencies, which I think that obviously at some point these currencies are going to again regain value because that's how the economy is going. So that's the issue. The other quick thing that I wanted to mention when I was listening to you is that correct me please if I'm wrong, but there are two ways in which Nepal is connected to these stories of city. One is through migrant workers going to the UAE and cities like Dubai, and that is very important, and forgive my ignorance, I imagine that there are studies, but that's a very important area to study. And this framework can be also very interesting because it's a different one, it's not the usual migration framework. That's one. And the second is for Nepal, but particularly Kathmandu, to become more and more a global center for tourism. And so how tourism becomes this engine for development, and how that is connected to the brand of the city, and how that brand is impacted by a number of factors. In the United States, for example, if you were to think about branding Kathmandu, one important obstacle to that is that every few months it's a big issue in the news, everything that happens with Mount Everest. And so that is presented as, you know, this sort of a very negative aspect of protection of the environment, the lines of people waiting to climb, you know, the mountain. And so essentially presents the country as a country that is not managing well the environmental landscape. And I don't say that that's the case, but the media presents that, and so all these efforts all these news are very interesting in how they play out brands. So tourism and branding, I think it's another way in which Nepal largely and then Kathmandu connect to this story.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Amani, for beautifully explained the urban landscape of 4 cities, which I have been there, 2 cities I have visited. But just I wanted to know, with the coming of climate change, challenge, have you looked into any environmental safeguards they have environmental safeguards measures they have taken care of in terms of, developing heat islands into the cities and shortage of water, even the urban flooding like that? Have you noticed that they have taken care of?
Absolutely. You have, you just mentioned, water in Dubai. There is a very, very large investment in access to water and sustaining access to water in the long term. So that's a very good example. In Singapore, there is a lot of work in all the coastal areas in terms of thinking how to redevelop the city, to protect the city and its various functions from rising sea levels. So I would say that even though it's difficult to compare, so we don't really compare that, but in connection to the story of Miami, Dubai and Singapore, particularly also because of the nature of their governments, are doing much better in terms of coordinating efforts, investment, and a future-looking strategy to address the impact of climate change on these cities. The other element that is important to note is that while on the one hand we talk about rising sea levels that will encroach on the urban environment, what we have as a global phenomenon, and these cities, particularly Dubai and Singapore, are very important in terms of that, is that the encroaching into the oceans has reached unprecedented levels. That is, around the world, what we see is more and more building, bringing dirt from inland and building more and more land that then will be constructed and taking over the oceans. And this is creating a new set of challenges because, of course, it's destroying ecosystems, it's having lots of problems, with fish. So it's a very interesting phenomenon as well. And if you've been to Dubai, you've seen, how the connection between real estate investment, the growth machine, and the encroaching into the oceans all is connected, and it is booming. Earlier there was the question, why we keep doing this? Well, we keep doing this because that's the nature of the capitalist world economy. These are decisions at the national and city level, yes, but everyone is inserted in the global system, and this is the way in which the economy works.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, please.
Thank you, Professor Adel. That was fascinating. Listening to the stories of the three great cities. Incidentally, I've been to all these three cities and lived there for considerable time durations. One aspect that I was expecting to hear from you, but perhaps that didn't feature, was the aspect of security, or let's say safety. Every time you go to Dubai, they claim to be the safest city in the world, and we can feel that over there. The same thing goes with Singapore. Singapore also is a very safe city. But in Miami, I wish I could say the same. When I was over there, the family where I stayed, they had a lot of restrictions. Okay, don't go over there in that area after this time in the night, or if you're over there, please just catch a taxi and come back as soon as it's possible. And once I was lost in one of those areas, and I called them, they said, "Oh, you were there? I don't know if I can come over there with my car," something like that. And also, the movies like, let's say, Miami Vices haven't done anything great to your reputation of being the safest city. So my question is this issue of safety or security, how much that may carry the significance in letting a city be a city of global significance or importance?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a great question. The issue of safety is absolutely crucial for cities and the way that cities project their brand, but it entails major contradictions and major clashes. I'll give you an example. Yes, Dubai actually has developed a system of police surveillance where the entire city is covered by cameras, and the authorities of the city clearly say we are building the safest city in the world where every single movement will be watched. The question, you see where I'm going with the contradictions, is, well, what is going to be your choice? Your rights being watched on absolute safety and security. Another example, Singapore. Singapore recently, I don't know if they already done it, but they were about to execute someone who had been caught dealing having a small amount of drugs. But as you know, Singapore has a very draconian law on drug trafficking. And so Amnesty International was singling out Singapore, saying there is no connection between the felony, the amount of drugs that this individual had, and the punishment, death penalty. And the response in Singapore is that we do this, so this is a place where there is absolutely 100% control over drugs, another aspect of safety and security. And you see Miami in the context of a democracy with all its problems, but a democracy where there is a system of civil political rights, where the enforcement on that level of safety and security is unlikely to happen. So this is going to be a very important topic for cities into the future, a major topic, and the tension is going to be exactly that. The tension between the use of technology to create an absolutely controlled society with the respect for individual rights.
Okay, thank you.
Namaste and good evening everyone. It's me, Hirendra Sai. I am from Tribhuvan University. I am a MPhil PhD scholar of Tribhuvan University, Central Department of Political Science. I have two questions. One is how to change the world system in the context of rise of China. And second is Nepal is one side, we have two neighbors, one side is China, the next side is India. So what kinds of geopolitical implications we are facing to our Nepal and other countries' relationships in your perspective?
Well, the first question, of course, it's a huge question, huge question about China. Let me very briefly refer to that from the perspective of cities, is that China has made tremendous investments with a very clear strategy, very focused strategy on creating cities that have these globalizing aspirations. And it has succeeded in some way with Shenzhen, and of course you have, the old case of Shanghai, but it is yet to be seen whether these Chinese cities will be able to aspire to have the role that Singapore has. And as I mentioned, the case of Hong Kong is a very interesting case that may be predicting that there are going to be important limitations in terms of attracting capital to these Chinese cities. So that's one element. It's a little bit more difficult for me to answer the second question, but let me just take the India side of it. Is that it is interesting when we look at Nepal and India, where in Nepal most of the migration and flows have to do with workers involved in service sectors, construction, etc. In India, there is now a significant growth in flows, not just of workers, but most importantly of capital. A lot of capital is leaving India, has been leaving India, and these investors are putting their money in Dubai. So it's very, very interesting what's happening in that sense, and how we can see these cities as magnets for workers, for capital, for investment, and how that plays out in different ways. Which, just one final comment, and this takes us to another part of the world. A place like Dubai attracts a lot of legal capital and a lot of illegal capital. One country that has been very, very important recently in terms of an inflow of investment into Dubai has been Russia. So a lot of money from Russia has moved to Dubai. So we see these constant flows and changes. And this is, with this I conclude, it's so interesting because when you look at cities from this perspective, you see that geopolitical and political events in different parts of the world have an impact on these cities. A very big, great story is the story of Miami, that the Cuban Revolution in 1959 was, to a significant extent, the reason eventually that Miami became an emerging global city, because Miami did not exist, was this peripheral city full of retirees and drug dealing. And the Cubans, highly educated Cubans who left Cuba after the revolution and went to Miami, figure out that that could be a place where, different from Latin America, they had legal security, so you could invest. Second, they realized that so many people with money in Latin America were looking for safe places to invest, and if they were to engage with them in Spanish, they will create a level of trust that will really help business, and that's essentially what they did. So that's the other element that we continue to see. You have the situation in Russia, and you see a new flow of capital. You look at how the world changes, and you look at the cities, and these cities are very interesting in that sense, and how their economy continues to change, because not because of what's going on in the city, but because of what's going on in other places.
Okay, I think that brings us to close to the questions. I think we started from these global cities, and ultimately we came down to what could be the ideal city then, right? What do we mean by urban security? Something like that, right? Comparing Miami, security situation, Dubai, and then Singapore, right? It's very interesting, but I think it's very difficult to say that what are the parameters of a city to be a secure city, right? Because we have lots of complexities there. For example, climate change itself, which relates with water, urban water security again, urban food security, urban livelihood security, urban agriculture, these kinds of things. And then, you're talking about this pan-optical society, cameras everywhere. Do we really want to live in those places, right? Do we think that that's secure place? When I was in New Zealand at the time, there was discussion about having, cameras even in school toilets also. And there was revolt, and then the government, school authorities, they backed down from that. So are people really willing to do those kinds of things? Do we want to live in those kinds of cities also, right? So these are, I think, some of the issues of concerns that we need to think of. At the same time, I always think about, does a city have carrying capacity? For example, when I look at Kathmandu city itself and the population here, and then the service delivery, we don't have sufficient amount of water. We don't have good service delivery system here. We don't have good road system here. There is traffic jam. It's now 5:30 or something like 5 o'clock, right? Now I think about jam, traffic, right? So does a city have carrying capacity also, or any number of population can live that? What's that? I think that's also an area we need to think of, we need to discuss. I think when we talk about cities in global scenario also, which can potentially be a model. Can Singapore be a model for Nepal? Can Miami be a model for Nepal? Can Dubai be model for Nepal? Right? And the built-in environment of Dubai city, goodness. Can that be? And we are talking about environmental conservation, we are talking about climate change issues here. Can that be a model at all? Right? And maybe it brings down to my earlier question, for example, what do we mean by development? Is United States, or can United States be model for development? Or can New Zealand be? New Zealand is completely agrarian country, while South Korea and United States of America, or China, you can see mega projects, mega cities, big bungalows, apartments, etc. What kind of development we are talking about in the context of Nepal also? Because we live in Nepal, right? We need to think about that issue also. And at the same time, employment, right? He was talking about lots of Nepali people, youth particularly, they go to Dubai or Middle East, let's say, because we don't have employment opportunities here. But then we have large number of populations who think that if they move to urban areas, right, they can change their life in terms of employment, access to health, access to education, these kinds of things. That's what they think. And if you go to rural areas today also, what you find is the hope is in the city. The aspiration is in the city. Right? There is hope, there is aspiration in the city. And from climate change perspective, again, in terms of global, let's say world, almost 70% of greenhouse gas emission is being emitted by what? Cities. 80% global wealth from cities again. Like how are we going to manage the cities then? Okay, it's a very interesting debate, right? And we need to think of how do we go ahead with these kinds of things. Well, the most interesting things in terms of climate change, which he introduced here in one of his analysis, that do we need infrastructural development for actual development or only for growth? Because economic growth and development are different things, they are not same thing, right? Economic growth, one can be very rich, another can be very poor. If we are talking about development, maybe there is some kind of social equity, equitable things, right? These kinds of things, right? So what are we talking about? What kind of development model we are thinking about? And in the age of climate change, there are books written by Tim Jackson, for example, Prosperity Without Growth also. There's possibility. We can go through green economy, right? Again, zero carbon economy, right? And those things have been written in different types of international agreements, like Paris Agreement is the next one. But are we really following these kinds of things? I think this is also a critical area for academics to look into, researchers to look into, policymakers to look into, how honest we are to these kinds of international commitments, right? And although there are lots of things, and I'm sorry I can't commit quite a lot about your books because I haven't got a chance to go through that. Once I get, I will give you some feedback on that. But thank you very much to both the presenters today, Professor Daniel O. Suman and Professor Ariel C. Amani, for your great presentations and enlightening me and the whole audience. Thank you very much. Give them a clap. Now over to Pramod sir.
Thank you, Chair, Dr. Pandey, and Professor Daniel. Professor, thank you so much for the very wonderful discussion. I really enjoyed a lot. And once again, welcome to Kathmandu. Enjoy your time. And we hope to continue this engagement. When you are in Kathmandu next time, we hope you are here again. We have a very small little love to share expression. And this one. And one little plant for our chair.
Okay. Wow.
We'd have to give him same, but it's difficult to take that.
Carry.
Next time.
Thank you.
come and see.
Thank you so much for being with us. Wonderful audience, please join us for tea. And we hope to be in touch through this kind of interaction. We have one virtual summit tomorrow. It's on Nepal-India relations. Please join us tomorrow online. And then on 12th, we have Nepal-China relations with Nepal Embassy in Beijing. So please join us for that. Thank you so much.
Maybe after we are going to
Okay,
take a
there
program.
is